Welcome back, everyone. This week, we're talking about manufacturing consent, a classic analysis of propaganda from Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. In the last few weeks, we've discussed some crucial things that individual knowers and knowledge communities need to function well. We saw that to flourish as epistemic agents, we need the concepts of knowledge and truthfulness so we can pick out reliable informants. And we need epistemic virtues like skillful reflection and intellectual perseverance to acquire and retain reliable knowledge. And for our epistemic communities to flourish, we saw that we need significant numbers of epistemically dependable people, people who are deeply committed to the epistemic virtues as intrinsically valuable. And we need fairly widespread mutual epistemic trust and epistemic justice. That is, we need a community wherein people are assigned an appropriate default credibility as knowers. What's more, we've also identified some major obstacles that individual knowers and knowledge communities face. As individual knowers, we've seen that epistemic vices, including the stealthy epistemic vices, can prevent us from acquiring, retaining, and sharing knowledge. And at the social level, we've seen how epistemically dysfunctional social structures like echo chambers and epistemic oppression can degrade our knowledge community. So far, however, we've said very little about what are arguably some of the most insidious and far-reaching forces that undermine our ability to know, namely ideology and propaganda. So we began this term by noting a recent explosion of the areas of vice epistemology and social and political epistemology. And part of the reason for this increase in research in these areas was a kind of panic surrounding the election of Donald Trump and the apparent rise of authoritarian populism around the world. A lot of mainstream liberal media sources were chock full of reporting about fake news, conspiracy theories, media bubbles, and echo chambers. So much so, in fact, that the Oxford Word of the Year in 2016, the year Trump was elected, was post-truth, which Oxford Language, an organization run by Oxford Unity Press, defined as an adjective relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So at the same time, academics also were kind of freaking out about these issues, including philosophers, and they began to devote an unprecedented amount of attention and time to these topics. And a lot of this work in the media and academia has been organized around the rhetoric of post-truth, the idea that we've entered a new era where truth no longer really matters like it used to. And we need to get back to the basics and the old norms of truth, accuracy, and sincerity in the press and political discourse. Some people have pushed back against this idea, though. For instance, my colleague, Lorna Finlayson, writing in the New Statesman, she summed up this sort of attitude towards post-truth in the following way. Until relatively recently, about the mid-2010s, things were basically okay. Not perfect by any means, but more or less well-ordered and rational. Then something went badly wrong. People lost contact with reality, even lost interest in truth itself. Many have been seduced by populists and conspiracy theories. They've lost trust in experts and institutions. All that we hold dear, our freedoms, our democracy, is under threat. Lorna then goes on to say that there has been a major shift in political discourse towards inaccuracy and bullshit and a lack of concern with the truth in general. But the problem is that this narrative is tied to an illusion about the past. This idea that there was this past wherein political discourse was basically accurate and fact-bound, as if before 2014, everything was just hunky-dory. But now we're in this post-truth epoch and no one cares about the truth anymore. What happened? The problem with this narrative, as Lorna puts it, is that the same people and outlets sounding the alarm about fake news are also those who bought and sold some of the biggest political lies of the 21st century. So, for example, the people who led American and British forces to bomb Iraq in 2003 on the dubious grounds that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The Iraq War is now universally recognized as a disaster. Everyone agrees. It's not really a partisan issue anymore. In fact, Trump himself frequently dished on the Bush administration for their unpopular war. What's more, the historical record fairly unambiguously shows that the Bush administration went to war on the basis of faulty intelligence, about which they systematically and intentionally misled the international community. If you want to listen to an interesting deep dive into that history, I really recommend the podcast represented here called Blowback. It's a very interesting look at the period leading up to the Iraq War and the war itself. One of the interesting questions about the Iraq War, though, is how did they do it? How did they pull this off? How did the Bush administration launch such a disastrous war on the basis of bad information with the whole world watching? Now, we looked a little bit at Qasim Qassam's analysis of Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney in Vices of the Mind. And he shows convincingly, I think, that they were catastrophically closed-minded, arrogant, and dogmatic. And those epistemic vices contributed to their major failings in Iraq. There's no doubt about that. But these people also managed to systematically mislead much of the world about the evidence regarding Saddam Hussein's possession of weapons of mass destruction. And they managed to do this while having very obvious vested interests in the war. For example, famously, Dick Cheney was the former CEO of Halliburton, and in the run-up to the Iraq War, Halliburton was awarded a $7 billion contract for which Halliburton was the only company allowed to bid. So what's my point? If we focus exclusively on phenomena like epistemic vices and echo chambers, we're missing an important part of the story, namely ideology and propaganda. The good old days before 2014 and the post-truth era were not really the good old days at all. Of course, there was less social media bullshit and stupefying conspiracy theories and so on. At least people were less aware of them. But there was no shortage of lies and ideology and propaganda to which we can turn our attention now. Specifically, we want to look at Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky's classic analysis of propaganda in their work, Manufacturing Consent. Before we begin, I want to briefly define two central terms for our discussion. First, we have ideology. This is a difficult, controversial notion, but just as a first pass, I want to suggest that you can think of ideology as social meanings that buttress, perpetuate, and justify social injustice, while simultaneously masking that injustice. So that's very important. Ideology provides people with resources for justifying and downplaying, and in fact, covering over the reality of that injustice. And also, we can define propaganda as the systematic dissemination of information, especially in a biased or misleading way, in order to promote a political cause or point of view. Okay, I just wanted to get those terms on the table because they're very important in Herman and Chomsky's analysis. As we're going to see in Manufacturing Consent, ideology and propaganda typically tend to work together, kind of hand in hand. So, for example, consider President George W. Bush's address to the nation on Thursday, September 20th, 2001. In speaking about the terrorist attacks of September 11th, George Bush says, "Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other." And so this is the ideological overlay that went a long way in justifying anything the Bush administration wanted to do. Why were they able to mislead the world about the alleged weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and go in and bomb Iraq without any significant opposition from the international community? Because they could draw on this rhetoric and ideology of freedom, saying that this isn't a coercive military intervention. This is Operation Iraqi Freedom. We're bringing freedom to Iraq.